Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. If I could have your attention up at the front. Good morning. My name is Jim Byron. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Richard Nixon Foundation, and welcome to the Nixon Library. This is our first indoor gathering at regular capacity since March of 2020. It's been a very long 15 months. So it certainly is a welcome sight to see all of you here today, as well as our eager conference listeners and participants. Today marks the 50th anniversary since the announcement of the Reversion of Okinawa Agreement was signed, after nearly 2 years of negotiations between the Sato and Nixon governments. With this in mind, allow me to briefly set the stage for why we're gathered here in Yorba Linda. President Nixon was a lifelong friend, admirer, and student of Japanese culture and history. His first trip to Japan was in November and December of 1953 on his and Mrs. Nixon's 60-day around-the-world trip as Dwight Eisenhower's vice president and second lady. It was on this trip that he first met Prime Minister Shigeru Yoshida, the beginning of a long relationship and friendship. They met many times over the years, 1955 in Washington, D.C., again in 1960, when Yoshida was a dinner guest at the Nixon's private residence. In fact, President Nixon wrote an entire chapter of his book Leaders about Shigeru Yoshida in 1982. And when the Nixon Library was built in 1990, he requested a life-size bronze statue of Yoshida be included in the Hall of Leaders, alongside Winston Churchill, Charles de Gaulle, and Konrad Adenauer. It was during that 53 visit that Vice President Mrs. Nixon met Emperor Hirohito and Empress Nagako. The two couples met again 18 years later in September 1971 when the President and First Lady flew to Anchorage to welcome the Emperor and Empress during their 90 minutes on U.S. soil, the first time ever for a Japanese emperor. In December of 53, Vice President Nixon delivered a groundbreaking speech to the U.S.-Japan Association in Tokyo, firmly establishing his deep interest and personal involvement in U.S.-Japan relations. Years later, he wrote that the war had been a tragedy, and the time had come to reestablish the tradition of Japanese-American friendship that had previously existed for so many years. The trip also impressed upon me the tremendous spirit of enterprise and discipline in post-war Japan. It seemed as if everyone we saw, from farmers in the fields to factory hands on the assembly lines, was working feverishly. The country was still pretty much on its back in 1953, but after this trip, there was no question in my mind that Japan would recover much more quickly than most Americans had predicted. When I got back to Washington, I became a staunch advocate of American-Japanese ties. During the 1960s, out of office in his wilderness years, Nixon made 7 separate trips to Japan to keep up to date and to see old and new friends. For example, in Tokyo in April 1964, he met for private talks with Prime Minister Ikeda, former Prime Minister Kishi, Foreign Minister Shina, and the Minister of International Trade and Industry. These talks would inform his thinking and worldview as he prepared for another run for the presidency. In October of 1967, his seminal article, Asia After Vietnam, shows his visionary thinking, including the pivotal part that Japan would play in a post-Vietnam world. On January 21st, 1969, his second day in office as president, National Security Study Memorandum 5 was issued, calling for new alternative policies with regard to a full range of U.S.-Japanese issues. The number one issue, the reversion of Okinawa. Prime Minister Sato visited the White House that November, his first trip to Washington as Prime Minister. Okinawa was the first item on the agenda. And 50 years ago today, June 17, 1971, the agreement for reversion was signed in Washington and in Tokyo. Prime Minister Sato sent a moving telegram referring to their earlier November meeting. He wrote, "Thanks for your statesmanship. We were able to reach agreement on the reversion of Okinawa. I'm deeply gratified that these efforts have culminated in the signing of the agreement today." And a few days later, the President replied, "This agreement has added to the strength of ties between us and to the interests which we share in common. I sincerely hope that the spirit which has characterized our negotiation of this agreement will similarly infuse the discussions before us on the other issues in our very durable relationship." In an interview in 1983, former President Nixon spoke about America and Japan in terms of current events and the scope of history. He said, "Look at this country. It's a country with no oil, no significant natural resources. The coal is virtually gone. It has less arable land than the state of California. And yet today, it's the second economic power in the free world. By the end of the century, it may have a per capita income larger than that of the United States. How does that happen? It happened for several reasons. Because of who the Japanese people are, highly intelligent, passion for education, great abilities not only to copy but to innovate, as they are in technology and many other fields. Strong Japan must be maintained if the Soviet attempts to move into China, for example, or other parts of Asia are to be thwarted. And in that connection, therefore, the Japanese-American alliance is absolutely essential. In April 1993, a year before he died, former President Nixon paid his final visit to Japan. Among the many old and new friends he met were Prime Minister Kaifu. As always, even as an elder statesman in his early 80s, he was there to study and he was there to learn. He was still pursuing the vision of a generation of peace and of a world and a time beyond peace, the title of his last posthumously published book. Still earning and deserving the greatest honor history can bestow, the title of Peacemaker. It is now my distinct pleasure to introduce another man who has devoted his life to freedom, liberty, and peace, Ambassador Robert O'Brien, who served as the 28th National Security Advisor from 2019 to 2021. He previously served as Special Envoy for Hostage Affairs and a U.S. representative to the UN General Assembly. Ambassador O'Brien had practiced law for 30 years in Los Angeles and has rejoined the firm that he founded with Judge Stephen Larson, Larson LLP, as of counsel. Would you please join me in welcoming Ambassador O'Brien?
Thanks for that terrific introduction, Jim. What a nice day to look out and see everyone. I don't see too many masks, and we're reopened. We're back. Orange County's back. California's back. It's just terrific to be here with you. We've kept going at the Nixon Foundation, and the Nixon Seminar we've been doing our events for the past several months, but we've been doing it by Zoom, and we haven't been with all our friends and colleagues. So welcome. So we're here today to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Reversion of Okinawa Prefecture to Japan. And there's probably no place more fitting to celebrate this signal accomplishment than here at the Richard Nixon Library and Birthplace. It was June 17th, 1971 that the agreement was signed, both in Tokyo and Washington. We'll be joined a little later today by two honored guests, Japan's Ambassador Tomita and its Consul General Muto. And we're going to welcome their excellencies to Orange County, to the Nixon Library and Birthplace. We've got a whole plethora of VIPs here, and I'm going to offend people by just mentioning a couple, but I do want to thank Chris Cox. He's the grandson of President Nixon and brings the family's love of this special piece of property with him every time he comes out here from New York. So thank you for being here, Chris, and thank you for representing your great family, your mom and your aunt, great American. I've also got two of my colleagues from the Trump administration are here. Mary Kissel, who served as a senior advisor to Secretary Pompeo. Mary and I spent plenty of time on the Secretary's plane, flying around the world on various missions. And Mary did great work. She brought the ideological argument to the table to make sure that we weren't being outspun by the Russians or the Chinese or the Iranians. And I appreciate all your great work on the communications front and communicating for the U.S. And we also have Kim Reed, who was the first woman chairman of the Exim Bank, which is an independent government agency in Washington. And Kim and I spent a lot of time traveling around the world, including Asia Pacific. And I always loved having Kim on the plane with me because she carried a big fat checkbook. And I could come tell people that I represent the president and that we've got and talk about the security concerns, but politicians are the same everywhere. And when you've got someone with you who can write $1 billion check to help an American company sell 5G to one of our partners, it was amazing how interested the presidents and prime ministers were in talking to Kim. They'd quickly shake my hand and go over and see where the money was. So that's some things haven't changed. They're the same overseas as they are here. And we have a number of other great guests that you'll meet and hear from on the panels today. So I'm honored to participate. So during my time as National Security Advisor, I visited Japan on several occasions. And Mr. Shigeru Kitamura was probably my closest colleague, or one of my closest colleagues among the National Security Advisors around the world. He was Japan's National Security Advisor. He had the confidence of Prime Minister Abe and then the confidence of Prime Minister Suga. And we were on the phone even due to the time difference, either late at night or early in the morning, almost every week or two. As a young officer in the U.S. Army, I did one of my reserve trainings at Camp Zama, just south of Tokyo, which, by the way, has a beautiful golf course on the base. Japan's a beautiful country. It's a close ally of the United States, and it's a very special place to me personally. I don't think the Japan-U.S. alliance was ever stronger than it was during the Trump administration. And thus I was very pleased to see that the very first visitor to President Biden at the White House was Prime Minister Suga. I think that represented continuity of the policy that we instituted, and shows that this relationship goes beyond partisan politics and is critical to both countries, both to Japan and to the United States. And I thought the gesture of President Biden inviting Prime Minister Suga to see him at the White House, even notwithstanding, I should say, the COVID restrictions, sent a strong message to our friends, but also to our adversaries. As we reflect on the U.S.-Japan relationship and discuss today what the future holds for our two nations, we can be thankful for the monumental step taken by President Nixon half a century ago. President Nixon made many decisions during his career, and especially during his time as president, in the foreign policy and national security region areas, fronts that met with criticism. This was one of them. But as he demonstrated time and time again, and we're seeing now, sometimes it's taken us 50 years to see the strategic wisdom of what President Nixon did. And the 1971 Okinawa Reversion Agreement with Japan is one decision that continues to show and demonstrate President Nixon's strategic genius. Think for a moment what would have happened if even if President Nixon had retreated from the full-throated criticism of his decision to return Okinawa at the time. A lot of national security hawks said it's strategic property. We can't give it up. It's important to U.S. national security in the Pacific. But President Nixon understood how important it was to return Okinawa to the people of Japan. If the United States still governed Okinawa today with its 1.5 million inhabitants, there's no doubt that it would have been an incredible sore point in the U.S.-Japan relationship. And that friction would have hindered many of the great accomplishments and developments that our nations have made together over the past 5 decades. More importantly, the Chinese Communist Party would have almost certainly argued that the Okinawa Prefecture and the Ryukyu Island chain were not Japanese territory, as evidenced by continued U.S. administration of those territories. Now, 50 years after the return of the prefecture to Japan, any such claim by the Chinese Communists is universally viewed as being entirely without merit. Okinawa plays a critical role in U.S. and Japanese security, notwithstanding the fact that it's now part of Japan, fully part of Japan. U.S. military bases on the island project American power in the Western Pacific. This presence is critical given the rise of China as an assertive and aggressive economic, political, and military competitor of both the United States and Japan. The United States and Japan consider the protection of major sea lines of communications, particularly the Strait of Malacca and the Bashi Channel, to be vital to our alliance's national security. A tremendous amount of trade flows through the Indo-Pacific, feeding the economies of Japan and the United States, and disruption of that trade by any potential adversary would have devastating economic consequences for both countries. U.S. Marines and U.S. Air Force Airmen stationed on Okinawa are ideally suited to respond to any crises involving sea lines of communications or other contingencies in the Western Pacific. U.S. forces on Okinawa work hand in glove with the Japanese maritime, ground, and air self-defense forces. And I can tell you from personal experience, those forces are those Japanese forces with whom we work, our allied partners, are highly capable forces. The nations of the Indo-Pacific now face the Communist Party of China, which has embarked on the greatest peacetime naval buildup since Germany built the Kaiserlich Marine prior to World War I. And that's not to mention China's massive investments in ground, air, missile, and cyber forces. Accordingly, as I've said many times in the past, the U.S.-Japan National Security Alliance is perhaps the most important security relationship in the world. The strength of that relationship was in no small part solidified by President Nixon's decision 50 years ago to end one of the last vestiges of World War II, the occupation of Okinawa, and to normalize the security relationship with Japan. So to get today together, Washington and Tokyo, with our allies in the region and our friends, will continue to foster a free, open, and prosperous Indo-Pacific. It's now my privilege to introduce Ambassador Gaddi Vasquez. Ambassador Vasquez was the Senior Vice President of Government Affairs for Edison and Southern California Edison. But before joining Edison, he served as a U.S. ambassador to the UN in Rome. Now that's, as I told him when we were walking in here, it's probably the best ambassadorship in the world. You get to live in Rome for 4 years, and you get to do great things like making sure the world's hungry are fed. And so that's a terrific ambassadorship. You must have been very good friends with President Bush to have landed that, because there are a few ambassadorships, Jerusalem, Dublin, Court of St. James, that there's a real fight over, and Rome's right at the top of that list. Prior to serving as our ambassador to the UN in Rome, Ambassador Vasquez was the director of the Peace Corps from 2002 to 2006. So I guess it was probably a little thank you for having done the hard work, or the Peace Corps hard work, for 4 years. Earlier in his career, he served as an Orange County supervisor and as Chief Deputy Appointment Secretary for our good friend who we lost a couple of years ago, Governor Duke-Majan, and as a police officer for the city of Orange. I mean, what a CV ambassador. So it's now my great pleasure to introduce him. Let me close by saying, may God bless Japan, and may God bless the United States of America. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you very much. Well, thank you, Ambassador O'Brien. I'm going to step to the podium for just a moment before we seat ourselves for the panel discussion. It is a great honor and a great privilege to be here at the Nixon Presidential Library and to be able to participate on this particular panel, which is going to address the history of the Senkaku Islands and the 1971 Reversion Agreement. We are fortunate today to have a very distinguished panel of leaders in the administration during President Nixon's presidency, but also the opportunity to hear from some of those who have studied intimately and profoundly the aspects of this agreement. And we're going to have a discussion that focuses on Japan post-World War II and the signing of the San Francisco Peace Treaty, Vice President Nixon's relationship with Japan and Japanese leaders in the 1950s and 60s, and discuss a little bit the negotiations between the Sato and Nixon administrations on the reversion of Okinawa, why, when, how, where, and also the announcement of the revision. So I am delighted, and I want to preface these introductions by saying that two of our participants are going to appear on the screen because they're going to be joining us virtually, and then two of us will be up here on the stage for this panel conversation. I'd first like to introduce Dr. Nobumasa Akiyama, who is a professor in the School of International and Public Policy at the Hitotsubashi University. And he joins us today live from Tokyo, where I'm told it is very, very early in the morning. From 2016 to 2018, Dr. Akiyama served as Minister Counselor to the Permanent Mission of Japan to the international organizations in Vienna, a noted branch of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He is a noted expert on disarmament and arms control. Also joining us virtually today, Richard V. Allen was U.S. National Security Advisor under President Ronald Reagan from 1981 to 1982. During the 1968 campaign for the presidency, he was Foreign Policy Advisor for Richard Nixon and the Nixon campaign, and was appointed Deputy National Security Advisor in the Nixon administration, and later served as Chief Advisor to Peter Peterson on international economics. He is a Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution and an international business consultant. Joining me today on the platform is Dr. Luke Nichter. He is the James H. Cavanaugh Professor in Presidential Studies at Chapman University. He is the author of the Nixon Tapes, Volumes 1 and 2, both New York Times bestsellers. He is also the author of Nixon in Europe, and most recently, The Last Brahmin, the first biography of Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr. So I'd like to invite Dr. Nichter to join me up here on the platform, and we'll welcome our other guests virtually. So in an era of technology and virtual connections, we have been told that we would see our two counterparts or friends on the screens here. I don't see them. There they are, just right on cue. Well, that's excellent. Welcome our two panelists. Welcome, Dick Allen, and welcome, Dr. Akiyama. We're delighted to have you. Hopefully, this is a sound check. You're giving me the nod that you can hear us, so thank goodness for good technology. And thank you to all the technical experts out there who are making this possible. We appreciate it. I'd like to start this morning by taking this question of residual sovereignty back to the San Francisco Peace Treaty. Right after the end of World War II, when all parties agreed that the United States was the sole administering authority of the Nansei Shoto south of 29 degrees north latitude, which included the Ryukyu and Daitu Islands. The U.S. made sure to note with some frequency that its administration was temporary. But it wasn't really, of course, as we know now, until 1971 that the revision actually took place. So we're going to examine some of those events that took place over that 25-year period this morning. And Dr. Akiyama, I'd like to begin with you, if I may, coming to us live from Japan. Can you set the stage for our audience here at the Nixon Library and those watching on the live stream? What was the state of the Senkaku Islands as World War II was over, and why were these islands so significant to the balance of power in the region?
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank Nixon Library and organizer of this conference. In fact, when receiving the invitation, I thought that I was going to talk about sort of arms control, which was a kind of great product of the great strategist, President Nixon. But so this is a kind of surprise attack for me that I was asked to address on the Senkaku Islands. But in fact, the Senkaku has been very important and significant in Japan's security and possibly the strategic environment in East Asia. And so, as you correctly pointed out, the residual sovereignty issue is the very, very difficult question. And in fact, in San Francisco, during the San Francisco conference, interestingly, the PRC or the Chinese Communist Party said that that the Senkaku or Okinawa has never been out of Japan's control. So, in fact, PRC recognized the Japan's sovereignty of Okinawa and Senkaku Islands. But of course, as many people are aware, that the Senkaku was kind of separated from the Okinawa sovereignty. Then, because of that, the Senkaku has been now the kind of thorn of the U.S.-Japan alliance, but at the same time, Japan-China relationship, and also Japan-Taiwan relationship. So, this current sort of outstanding question on the settlement of the alignments, strategic alignments between Japan and United States, Japan, Taiwan, Japan, China, in fact, started from the beginning of the post-war history. And I think my probably take on the interpretation of the contemporary interpretation of the issue in this in terms of significance, the contemporary security environment is that since the 1950s, the ambiguity on the sovereignty over the Senkaku is posing us a great sort of a question on what alliance can do and what alliance need to do and what alliance should do in order to check the rise of China, in order to deter the Chinese sort of expansion and assertiveness in East Asia. So I defer to the great historian and the colleague panelists on further details about the sort of, the legal and political arrangement of the Senkaku issue. But, I stop here and just like to say this is a very, very significant strategic question that we are still facing. Thank you.
Very much, Dr. Akiyama. We'll probably be delving into that topic a little more as we discuss other topics as well. Dr. Nichter, welcome. And Richard Nixon was so often in the 1950s the highest ranking or near highest ranking official to visit so many countries around the world, coming off the end of World War II as Britain's empire transitioned into the Commonwealth and former colonies became democracies. As was mentioned earlier, one of those countries that Richard Nixon visited was Japan. In 1953, the VP and Second Lady Nixon met Emperor Hirohito only 8 years after the end of the war. President Nixon says on the Nixon tapes that by 1969, he had visited Japan 7 times. Can you talk a little bit about the personal interest that the President had in Japan and how he viewed the alliance between the U.S. and Japan by the time that he became president in 1969?
Sure. Thank you very much, and I'm sure Dr. Allen can fill in any gaps here that I might miss. But I think let's start back with the 1966 highly successful midterm elections for Congress, and the day after, former Vice President Richard Nixon announces a break from politics. It wasn't a break from work. I think he worked even harder over the next 6 months by his around-the-world trips that led to Asia after Vietnam, his Bohemian Grove speech, where he gave signals about what his thoughts were about the future of East Asia. And I think he approached the issue in terms of really 3 different contexts. I think he approached the issue in terms of the Cold War context, in terms of superpower relations between the United States, the Soviet Union, and China. Meanwhile, the United States is beginning negotiations to wind down its involvement in Vietnam in the war. I think the second context was the evolving security situation in East Asia. And I think many Americans don't realize that when you talk about Okinawa and look on a map, it's much closer to Taipei or Shanghai and even Hong Kong than Tokyo. And I think that the third situation, the third context that President Nixon approached this issue in his thinking in the late 60s was the requirements of domestic economic and political needs. Just as in West Germany, Japan was 25 years into a miraculous economic recovery. The United States was looking to rebalance some of its relationships with allies. Both nations had transformed themselves politically, economically, into regional leaders. And I think we see the glimpse looking forward of President Nixon's strategy in the presidency of, instead of just superpowers and everyone else, establishing kind of regional security pillars and regional powers. And you see this in terms of the Shah in Iran. You see this in terms of West Germany, Ostpolitik, and renegotiating its relations with its eastern neighbors. And finally, you see it in terms of Japan. So I think it's really the nexus between these sort of 3 contexts is what informed his thinking in the late 1960s.
Dick, you were the Nixon campaign's foreign policy advisor in 1968, and you spent an incredible amount of time with the candidate in 1968. Was Japan an issue, and were the islands an issue specifically that was on the campaign's radar in 1968? Dick, I think you're on mute.
Beg your pardon?
There you are. Now we can hear you.
Someplace, I don't know, modern technology.
Here.
During 1968, Japan was quite important. But I want to just speak for a minute about the prelude to 68 in regards to Japan. In 1967, I traveled from the Hoover Institution, where I was permanently, to New York, met with Mr. Nixon, and had a long discussion with him about a trip I was about to take to Japan. And he said, well, I'm going to write a couple of letters for you that you can take with you and use for important people in Japan. And I'd like you to talk to them as well. I said, yes, sir, I would. But he asked also that if I had any ideas of my own. And I said, yes, I do. And reversion was on the top of my mind. That is, reversion of Okinawa to Japan. And it was also very much on the top of his mind. And I said, then, therefore, do I have your permission to raise this with the very important people with whom you are connecting me? And the answer was yes, indeed. So raise it, but not negotiate it. Simply raise the issue, determine their level of interest, and move ahead. Come back and have a discussion with Mr. Nixon, and next steps would be taken. So that's what I did. I carried letters from Mr. Nixon. I took them down to the Japanese ambassador in Washington to make sure that things were set up for me when I arrived in Japan. And as I arrived in Japan, that was precisely the case. My visit was taken into hand by the Cabinet Research Office, which is a critically important part of the foreign, was it at the time, the Foreign Office at the time. And I was led hand in hand, so to speak, from one important person to another. And I carried a letter to the former Prime Minister of Japan, Fukuda Takeo, who became my very, very close friend over the next several years. So having visited there, I returned, had the discussion about the interest of no question about the interest of the Japanese side. I returned to New York and reported all of this to Mr. Nixon. And pretty soon he decreed that I should leave the Hoover Institution at Stanford and move to New York, which I said I did not want to do. The way they affected my removal to New York was to, on a leave of absence from Hoover, was to send a very wealthy donor of the Hoover Institution to New York from the Nixon campaign and put the pressure on. And pretty soon I was sprung and I was off to New York City, more or less against my will. With a family of 6 kids, my wife drove a Chevrolet station wagon across the United States with 6 kids without seat belts, I might add, while I flew. And that was quite the most important achievement of the summer was her safely reaching the East Coast, where we had a summer home in New Jersey, and they could put in. So that led to a really interesting situation where I was then subsequently introduced to an exceptionally wide range of Japanese interests in things of this nature in the government and also outside the government. So more about that later.
The scenario that you described about your movement from the West Coast to the East Coast, glad that played out well, ultimately.
I might add one thing. One thing that's very important here. Without RN's article, October 1967 Foreign Affairs, called Asia After Vietnam, none of this would have happened. And in that article, which I could not sell to any newsman as in the position of Director of Foreign Policy and National Security Matters in the campaign, I couldn't sell it to anybody to read it and get serious about it and write about it, because in that article is foretold the forthcoming meeting with Japan, not directly, but again obliquely, which was Mr. Nixon's way. So,
well, that's a good segue, because once you were in the White House, President Nixon met with Prime Minister Sato just months after he assumed the presidency. Can you elaborate on why that was, and why did the administration, if you could just elaborate a little, because now I'm talking in the context of the White House itself, is why this was an imperative in foreign policy at that particular time? Was there something?
Well, he met with whom, you're saying?
When with Prime Minister Sato, only months after becoming president.
Yes.
Why was that such an important goal of American foreign policy so early in the president's tenure? Can you cast some light on that?
Well, yes, RN liked to operate at the top and would like to have conversations from which would flow secondary considerations, such as the actions to be taken. And I believe that was a perfect example of it.
Good. Professor, any reflections or thoughts, reaction to what you've just heard in terms of the president?
I think I would add, I think there was also an economic element to the timing of all of this too. I think one of the experiences of the Johnson administration that the Nixon administration also understood is that a lesson of the 1960s was that guns and butter, the Great Society and Vietnam War, were both too expensive. And I think part of the American goal in the Nixon years was to rebalance in these allied relationships. And so even leading today in 1971, you have concerns over gold and the link between the dollar. You have trade and textiles. You have Japan really moving from, becoming really a first-tier ally, is the impression you get in a lot of the records and in the Nixon tapes. And more Japan is being mentioned in the same breath as the American relationships with Great Britain, with West Germany, with France, certainly on trade, in terms of economics, where Japan had gone from needing aid and recovery, just like West Germany, to not just standing on its own, but by the late 1960s becoming even a commercial competitor, a friendly commercial competitor of the United States. And so a dramatic transformation, economically, politically. And so I think what Nixon recognized is that what we were talking about was really the end of the post-war era was taking place. And we were entering a new kind of yet unknown, unnamed phase in history that was kind of being built. The plane was being built while it was in flight. And so I think he recognized the importance of change, that a new pivot was occurring in Asia. And I think that's why Japan was central to so many of these topics, in terms of monetary, economic, trade, and of course political on the islands.
So Dick, coming back to you, who was leading the negotiations and driving the process at that time?
He used diplomatic channels, and
yes.
The idea was to try to enlist the State Department to be as enthusiastic as Mr. Nixon had been, and to get them to do the homework. Just to read the October 1967 article, that was the hardest homework that was ever assigned. By the time, shortly thereafter, after my visits, and I left the Nixon administration, and as a result, joined a presidential commission on international trade and investment policy. And there I carried the flag not only for reversion, ultimate reversion, but also for Japanese-American relationships. And then the automobile sector mentioned became a really sore point. And all of a sudden, we were confronted with Japanese automobiles all over the place. The question was whether they were going to overrun our market. There was a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment in the country, and the automobiles didn't particularly help, but they were good automobiles. And it was hard to keep them out of our market. And so that became a real issue at the time, and it was but ultimately the Japanese had to provide us with a special ambassador for that purpose, just to come and negotiate automobiles. But we thought that there was an amazing opportunity in promoting U.S. trade to Japan. Just more difficult to get U.S. brands into Japan than it ever was to get Japanese brands in the United States. Now, they were better organized. They had the channels set up for themselves, and either they used existing frameworks or set them up themselves, as I said, and they succeeded, whereas American products didn't succeed very well, and American automobiles did not succeed very well in Japan.
Thank you very much for that. Dr. Akiyama, you are regarded as an international public policy professor, professional historian. Can you take us through the Sato government's position on the matter of the reversion of Okinawa and why this was being pursued and supported by the Sato government as well? What were some of the Japanese domestic and political considerations? Because in reviewing and researching and reading preparation for today's panel, I know that he had made, I believe, a 3-year commitment to achieve the reversion in a period of 3 years. Can you walk us a little bit through some of the backstory of the reversion as it relates to the government of Prime Minister Sato?
Right, thank you. I think this is a very critical for actually Japanese identity. When the sovereignty of Senkaku, that Okinawa was recognized that of Japan, then at the San Francisco Peace Treaty, it's been a kind of long desire for the entire Japanese to regain the cohesiveness of the nation. That is the reversion of the territories which were under trusteeship of United States. So the Ogasawara was returned earlier, but then the Sato administration's very serious mandate was to regain the sovereignty over Okinawa. And also the important was the reversion of Okinawa must come with the sort of elimination of nuclear weapons from the Okinawa. So the reversion without nuclear weapon was kind of its manifesto or promise with the people. So the Sato was very enthusiastic about the negotiation on the return of the sovereignty over Okinawa. And also another critical issue was how that is not about Sato administration itself, but how the sovereignty over Okinawa and the sovereignty over Senkaku are kind of coupled or decoupled through the Taiwan side. So I would argue that when we try to understand the contemporary frame of the Senkaku issue, we also need to look at the two triangles. One is Japan, Taiwan, and United States. How United States negotiated with Taiwan and Japan, and also the Japan, United States, and China. And particularly as Mr. Allen mentioned, there was a very serious trade issues. And one of the issue is the textile trade. So there was a overflow of textile products from East Asian countries to the United States. And so that issue was one of the most important, the issues between Japan and the United States. And that was kind of linked with the reversion of Okinawa. So on the US side, I think the United States, the Nixon administration need to deal with the control over the overflow of the textile products from Asian countries. And so in that respect, I think US government need to take care of Japan at the same time Taiwan, and Taiwan at that time became aware of the sovereignty over Okinawa along with the Senkaku. So I think that made the situation a little bit complicated.
Interesting. I'll put this question out to both of the professors on this panel. The gross national product in Okinawa in 1968 was $644 million. 260 million of it was derived from U.S. military spending. I think Professor Akiyama alluded to it somewhat generally. Professor Nichter, was this a factor, you think, to be considered to be weighed in the balance?
Well, it was certainly a concern as we approached 1971, because this was a time, again, most Americans don't realize that the dollar was still linked to gold at $35 an ounce, and the United States maintained at Fort Knox in Kentucky the appropriate gold reserves based on the number of dollars that were in circulation. And we had really reached the danger level by the summer of 1971. So right in the same time period as what we're talking about today, 50 years ago. 50 years ago in the summer of 1971, the United States had dropped below $10 million of gold in Fort Knox for over $30 billion of printed dollars that were in circulation. You can see that will catch up to you at a certain while when you print money and you don't have gold to back it. And so in the same time period here, addressing inflows and outflows of spending. And in terms of trade imbalances, the United States had a trade imbalance with Japan, with West Germany, especially places where we had large numbers of troops that were stationed overseas. And so I think it was a question, where can we make cuts realistically? And especially in the case of Japan and in West Germany, both nations, I think, took a similar path in terms of end of World War II being disarmed, large numbers of American troops stationed there, dramatic economic development and growth and return to stability and responsibility in the world. And so I think all of these issues were also in the mindset of President Nixon in order to correct these economic imbalances that occurred. And I think possibly what we're talking about today, could even have occurred a few years earlier, but the U.S. had consumed so much political capital and energy in the Vietnam War that I think there was a backlog of issues that had to be addressed around the world. And so in the first 2 or 3 years of the Nixon administration, look at the range of activity in all the places of the world, not just because you had a leader with a personal inclination to take on these issues, because I do think the U.S. also had to rebalance its own place in the world. And I think there was a backlog, a number of backlogs. So I think economic issues, monetary issues were reaching ahead at the same time as the Okinawan issue in the summer of 1971.
Are you able to comment on the political climate in Washington once the administration had advanced this agreement? What kind of a climate the president of the administration encountered in Washington?
Well,
Congress and so forth.
Nixon he was known for his Nixon shocks. These sort of dramatic announcements, where even sometimes his closest allies weren't sure what was coming. He loved to keep the press off guard. Both houses of Congress were controlled by the Democrats for all 5.5 years, so he liked to keep them off guard. And sometimes even his closest aides would comment, I wasn't quite sure that's what the announcement was going to be, or he would silo work so that sometimes not other than maybe Henry Kissinger might not see kind of the whole picture at times. And so you look at the summer of 1971, and not just Okinawa, but you have July 15th on television announcing that President Nixon would be the first president to visit the People's Republic of China in the coming year. A month later, on August 15th, preempting Bonanza on Sunday night on television, was announcing the temporary severance of the link between the U.S. dollar and gold at $35 an ounce, and that would take a couple years until 1973 to work out. But this whole summer was a series of major announcements, of major shocks, and I think that was very characteristic of kind of Nixon, who he was as a leader.
Dick, do you have a perspective on that in terms of the political climate? Dick, let me put that on hold for a second. Professor Akiyama, any reaction or comments to the question about the expenditure, military spending in Okinawa in 1968 as a consideration or a factor in the negotiations?
Well, I I don't think I have anything to add on that part, but just would like to comment on the so-called Nixon shocks. The two announcements. That one is the president's visit to China, and also the another one is sort of the suspension of convertibility of gold and dollar. They are remembered by Japanese as Nixon shocks. So, the former had a really great implication on our strategic consideration first. And second one is more about sort of the kind of fear that might lead Japanese economy into confusion. And we are aware of this sort of a trade surplus vis-a-vis United States. So we understand the logic, but still, those announcements were made without any prior sort of a thorough consultation with Japan. So that was, even though the basic tone of the US-Japan relationship was excellent, but those huge strategic decisions, two decisions, are kind of remembered by Japanese as shocks. So that also set kind of some tones for the rest of the sort of negotiation and the relationship with the Nixon administration on the sort of Senkaku or the relationship with China as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I apologize for jumping around here, but I didn't want to preclude Professor Akiyama from commenting on the issue of the military spending in Okinawa. But I want to come back to Dick Allen to follow up on the question that the professor was commenting on about the political climate in Washington. When this agreement was ready to be advanced and made public, what was the political climate like for this agreement as a matter of foreign policy?
Well, if you speak of the general climate toward moving ahead with reversion, is this what you're speaking of?
Yes, correct. Yes.
Well, this was
specific to Washington, of course.
This was slow and steady in Washington. Reversion of Okinawa was not a burning issue. The opening to China, as Professor pointed out, was one of the contributing shoku, as the Japanese called it, and that was an unwelcome surprise. And there was another variant of that in the automobile shoku, namely the decisions we were taking to try to inhibit Japanese automobiles, and with that, generally speaking, Japanese products entering the United States. So there was a great deal of residual ill feeling, I think, about various topics relating to Japan, which found their expression in this so-called shoku movement. And it was too bad that we didn't take psychological steps, and I might add here, psychological warfare steps could be deployed to lessen that shock. We did not anticipate any of that shock. And the shock visits by Kissinger to Tokyo were exceptionally unfriendly, received an exceptionally unfriendly reception in Japan.
Thank you for that.
If I can add one thing.
Yeah.
I was thinking of something that Dick Allen mentioned earlier, going back to Asia after Vietnam in 1967 in Foreign Affairs, is that some of the issues that we're talking about were received as shocks. Yet Nixon had made several signals that this was the direction that he intended to move. And I don't know that these were taken any more seriously in Washington than they were in capitals around the world. But a number of signals had been sent. I think sent fairly. Now we can look today with hindsight and say that's what he was talking about. And you can look back even further and see President Johnson, in beginning, say, 1966, as he started to move more to the negotiating table to get out of Vietnam and consider other alternatives to winding down American military Southeast Asia, besides just victory on the battlefield, but possibly victory at the negotiating table. You see, even President Johnson, as early as 66 and 67, is suggesting there needs to be a new relationship between the United States and China. And I mean, Nixon wasn't the only one. I think he's gotten the lion's share of the credit. But I mean, a number of signals have been sent. But I think these were so dramatic. I mean, we've lived with these for 50 years, and we kind of assumed this was just the fabric of U.S. foreign policy that evolved organically over time. But I think a number of signals had been sent, and I don't think people were very willing to take those seriously because these were so dramatic. And so I think that's one element here I think that's important, is that these were shocks. I mean, this was something brand new in U.S. foreign policy. But the signals and the groundwork had been laid for several years.
Interesting.
I'd like to also point out that one of the major shocks being the opening of relations with China. This was something entirely Mr. Nixon's idea. While Henry Kissinger was the messenger, he was the messenger only. He did not open China. It was done exclusively by the strategy laid down by President Nixon. And that's an important point to make. And the element of surprise may have been very well calculated by Henry to utilize for his own purposes in his own moment. But the major work and the heavy lifting here was all done by RN, Richard Nixon.
And he announced his trip to the People's Republic of China 31 days after the Reversion Agreement. I think that's the historical date, correct?
Yep.
Good. So let me talk a little bit about the diplomatic side of things and welcome your comments if you have a perspective. Face-to-face diplomacy is of great value in these kinds of circumstances. Any of you, maybe Dick, I'll start with you. You probably had the front row seat to some of this, but how would you characterize the interaction, the relationship between Prime Minister Sato and President Nixon? Did you have a line of sight to that, and maybe some commentary on how that contributed to the outcome?
Well, I think it worked quite well because both men were candid with each other in the discussions. A lot would reside later on with the implementation of things, including the work done by you, Alexis Johnson, in the State Department, and others in the State Department who received no mention whatever for their work, and on the NSC staff. So there were people who worked that problem as well. John Holdridge was a perfect example of a long-serving bureaucrat in the NSC staff who wielded a mighty stick, and was an important man. So there were people who were interested in it, and I worked it from the standpoint of with Pete Peterson on the international economic side. And then you had the entire Commerce Department of Maurice Stans, which was very interested in developing a structure for dealing with the Chinese and the Japanese upon reversion of Okinawa, particularly, because that would be a signal for many, many other things to follow. If we get the reversion straight, then it would be a major, major accomplishment. I have I might say, the irony of a young Marine first lieutenant named Alan, my grandson, who happens to be in Okinawa and in and out of Okinawa and Japan at present.
Thank you. Professor Nichter, you've studied Richard Nixon. Any thoughts in terms of the dynamics of the relationship between Prime Minister Sato and the President?
You know, So I have heard Richard Nixon speak a lot on the tapes. And, you know, there used to be a joke I told when our 7-year-old daughter was born. I think there was a time when she thought Richard Nixon was her grandfather because she heard his voice so much bouncing off the hallways and being played from the speakers of my computer. But before you accuse me of child abuse or anything else, you know, I think Nixon, like other leaders, didn't always get it right. But what was unique about Nixon was his time of study and preparation for the job. And he didn't require on-the-job training.
That's right.
That's unique in politics. I mean, politicians don't have time to go to a library and read books that are all about this big on a subject. And, you know, while the focus of his wilderness years is often the wilderness, wandering around directionless and aimless, he wasn't directionless. And I think that's what's unique. As you look, at the introduction at the outset here, we heard excerpts of his first visit to Japan, first state visit of any foreign leader to Japan in 1953. I mean, that's the length of the... So when he reached the presidency in the late 1960s, in all the major countries of the world, you have an average of 15 or 20 years of knowledge, of relationships that you
That's
can draw
right.
on. And Americans don't always understand that other nations in the world, with their diplomatic posts in Washington, you know, the U.S. ambassador might be the next foreign minister when they go home. They might be the next prime minister. I mean, this is a senior diplomatic post to be in Washington. And so by the time Nixon became president, they had also moved up over the 15 or 20 years in these countries. And so he became president as someone who had exceptional preparation, but so did his foreign counterparts, who had kind of risen in seniority along with him throughout the 50s and 1960s. And so I think that's what strikes me about Richard Nixon as being kind of a unique figure in the presidency. Again, among many exceptional people over 200 plus years, is that he had time to think and write and prepare. And when you look at the archive, the research room, you know, on the floor below us, you see he was a writer. I mean, he was a thinker. And his ideas, you can see played out in writing, his ideas. And it's really fascinating to think how much time he spent focusing on study and reading and doing the hard work. He was his own foreign policy advisor. I mean, he had Dick Allen, he had Henry Kissinger, he had George Shultz, he had John Connally, and other really kind of A-list political figures across the political spectrum. But he was his own foreign policy, and he relied on his own instincts and not those of others, often going against the grain, going against the consensus in his cabinet and among his senior staff. And so I think it's important to make the point that he really was a unique figure for his time and in American history. And he devoted a lot of personal time and work to understanding the parts of the world that he operated in.
Thank you for that. Very, very good.
I'd add that pay close attention to Luke Nichter, in my view, because he has it just about right in every respect. Mr. Nixon prepared when he saw that he was gaining, shall we say, gaining momentum, even well before the election. My visit to and bringing back the report from my meeting with the Japanese that I met with there, all high-ranking. The three that I met with had been political prisoners in the same jail. They were influential, and he was able to create back channels of his own through that method. So therefore, he had a much better understanding and knowledge of the Japanese situation and its degree of ripeness for restoration, not only in bilateral relationships, but Japan in the world. And Mr. Nixon was the man who replaced Japanese in the world. Japan in the world. Once the reversion of Okinawa and a number of other matters had been handled. Really, really important. So Luke Nichter has his hands on this material, and I would go there for verification.
Thank you, Dick. Thank you. Professor Akiyama, any remarks or views, perspectives on the relationship between Prime Minister Sato and President Nixon in terms of the dynamics of achieving this outcome?
Well, I think that Prime Minister Sato really heavily relied on the decision by the president himself. And I think it's well known, secret is that the kind of secret envoy, Professor Wakaizumi, had a direct communication with Dr. Kissinger, and they negotiated on this, particularly on the secret nuclear agreement. But at the same time, my actually observation through the study on the President Nixon's achievement, it seems he had a very good sort of strategic balanced view on what to sort of prioritize the issues. And for example, when the discussion was made on the how they're going to deal with the textile issue and the reversion of Okinawa, I think the economic side people like Mr. Peterson insisted to actually use the reversion of Okinawa as a kind of negotiation card for the gaining from Japan on the sort of gaining concession from Japan in the textile negotiation. But that was actually rejected by president, saying that the Nixon president had already made enough commitment, and it's already kind of too important to withdraw. So he had a very good sort of sense of priority, and also he had a vision of what would be the importance of relationship with Japan in the context of sort of overall political agenda.
Thank you, Professor. I wanted to end the line of questioning or discussion today with the question about the relationship between Prime Minister Sato and President Nixon. And I did so because in preparing for today's gathering, researched and read some of the communication correspondence because I was privileged to have known President Nixon and spent considerable time with him, was instrumental in the development of this presidential library. And so I came to know the president as someone who has been mentioned by Dick Allen and others, the professor, liked to communicate and write. And I was always intrigued by the historical data that exists about how much emphasis he placed on and valued relationships, particularly in the foreign policy arena. And I'll read you something that is striking. It's part of the protocol, part of the process, but nevertheless, I think reflected a certain bond, shall we say, or openness between these two world leaders. Dear Mr. President, we have just completed the signing of the Okinawa Reversion Agreement since my meeting with you in November of 1969, in which, thanks to your statesmanship, we were able to reach agreement on the reversion of Okinawa. Sustained negotiations were carried out between our two governments. I am deeply gratified these efforts have culminated in the signing of the agreement today. I am resolved to renew my efforts to further promote friendly ties between the United States and Japan. Prime Minister Sato of Japan. And then there was a second letter that was addressed to the President, again from the Office of the Prime Minister. And I'll read you an excerpt which, as a former director of the Peace Corps, anytime I hear talk about peace, it certainly raises and piques my interest. But I'll read you an excerpt of the letter, and I quote, "During our talks, we have had a very fruitful exchange of views on the international situation in general, placing particular emphasis on Asia, as well as the opportunity of reviewing our bilateral relations as both of our countries face a new era. I am confident that through these talks, we have been able not only to place our bilateral relations on an even firmer basis than heretofore. But we have also succeeded in contributing significantly to the cause of world peace. The words of the Prime Minister of Japan, Prime Minister Sato. And so on these notes and with these reflections, I want to extend our thanks to our three panelists, professors. Dick Allen, thank you for participating in today's panel. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been a pleasure to be able to lead this discussion, and thank you for the opportunity to be with you today. Thank you.
Let's thank our panelists again. And ladies and gentlemen, you are released for the next 20 minutes to get some coffee, refresh, and we'll meet you back here at 12 noon as we start our second panel.